Hello, welcome to the Tri-State Dairy Expo's How to Judge Dairy Cattle workshop. This presentation was put together by the Iowa State University's dairy judging team. We judge dairy cattle based on the Purebred Dairy Cattle Association's Unified Scorecard. The PDCA has 4 categories consisting of udder, which consists of 40% of the scorecard, dairy strength, which consists of 25% of the scorecard, rear feet and legs, which consists of 20% of the scorecard, and frame, which consists of 15% of the scorecard. Today we are going to evaluate these 4 components and compare 2 different individuals based on their phenotypic traits. When we are evaluating an individual's udder, we want to look at her udder depth, her rear udder, her teat placement, her udder cleft, her foreudder, her teats, as well as her udder balance and texture. Look at these 2 individuals while I describe the characteristics of an ideal cow's udder. When looking at her udder depth, you want the individual's udder to be held high above her hock, taking her age into consideration. You also should look for adequate capacity throughout. When looking at her rear udder, an ideal udder has a high, wide rear udder attachment with a lot of pop and fill around her rear quarters. Her teat placement should be square in the middle of each quarter and hanging perpendicular to the ground. The cow's udder cleft should be well defined, cutting both of her quarters evenly in half and continuing from the top to the bottom of her udder. When looking at the individual's foreudder, it should be long and smooth blending into her body wall. Looking at the teats, the ideal teat length is 2 1/4 inches long. They should be long and proportional in width, not too skinny and not too thick. Lastly, the ideal udder should exhibit a lot of texture, venation, and pliability throughout, as well as being balanced and equal from quarter to quarter. Now, after thinking about these characteristics of the ideal udder, which individual do you think would win the udder category of the PDCA scorecard? When judging a cow's dairy strength, we are looking at her ribs, her chest, her barrel, her thighs, her neck, her withers, as well as her skin. Let's use these 2 individuals to look at these components a little bit closer. When evaluating an individual's ribs, we would like to see ribs that are spread wide apart and that are flat, deep, and slanted towards the rear, as well as ribs that are well sprung, expressing fullness and extending outside the point of her elbows. When looking at her chest, we want to see a deep and wide chest floor, showing great capacity for vital organs with well-sprung foreribs. Moving on to her barrel, we like to see a long barrel with adequate depth and width that increases towards the rear with a deep flank. Next, we want to look at her thighs. We want to see thighs that are lean, incurving to flat and wide apart from the rear. When looking at her neck, we also like to see a long, lean neck that blends smoothly into her shoulders, with a clean-cut throat, dewlap, and brisket. When looking at her withers, we want to see her withers be sharp, with her chine being prominent. And lastly, when looking at her skin, we want it to look thin, loose, and pliable. Take a minute to look at these 2 individuals and compare their dairy strength based off of the qualifications that I just described. When judging an individual's rear feet and legs, we first like to look at how they move around the ring. Then we like to look at how her rear legs look from the side view and the rear view, as well as her feet, her thorough position, her hocks, her bone structure, as well as her pasterns. Using these two cows as a reference, let's discuss the components of the rear feet and legs category. When watching a cow's movement, we like to see that she can move fluently and gracefully around the ring. She should also be carrying her head up high with a straight back, with her back feet replacing her front feet's place with each step. When looking at her rear legs from the side view, we want to see a moderate set or angle to the hock. And from the rear, we would like to see that her legs are straight and wide apart with feet squarely placed. When judging her feet, we want to see a steep foot angle with deep heel and with short, well-rounded closed toes. When looking at the ideal cow's throw position, we should see a near central placement between the hip and pin bones. And the ideal hocks will have adequate flexibility with freedom from swelling. Next, when we look at her bone structure, we want to see flat and clean bones with adequate substance. And lastly, her pasterns. We want to see an ideal cow with short and strong pasterns with some flexibility, having a moderate upright angle. Based off of what I just described, which individual do you think has the better set of rear feet and legs? When judging a cow's frame, we examine their rump, front end, back and loin, stature, and their breed characteristics. While viewing these individuals side by side, let's break down the frame components together. When looking at an ideal cow's rump, it should appear long and wide throughout, with her pin bones being slightly lower than her hip bones. Her throat should be centrally located, with her tail head set slightly between her pin bones. When looking at her front end, it should be wide through her chest floor, with her front legs squarely placed beneath her. Her shoulder blades and elbows should also be set firmly against her chest wall. Moving on to her back and loin area, it should be straight, strong, and crisp down her top line. Her stature should be rather tall, and her withers and hips should be relatively proportionate to each other. And lastly, her breed characteristics. She should exhibit overall style and balance, and appear feminine and clean cut from her head on back, and exhibit overall dairy character. Looking at these two individuals, who do you think exhibits the most desirable frame? And that's it. Thank you for participating in the Tri-State Dairy Expo this year, and I wish you the best of luck with your future dairy judging careers.